Welcome to FACT's webinar called Grazing Management from the Soil and Plant Perspective. This is part one of a three-part series featuring presenter Sarah Flack and hosted by Food Animal Concerns Trust. I am Larissa McKenna, FACT's Humane Farming Program Director, and I will be moderating today's session. So before we dive right into the presentation itself, I do have a few quick introductions. For those of you who are new to us, Food Animal Concerns Trust or FACT, we are a national nonprofit organization and we're headquartered in Illinois. We promote the safe and humane production of meat, milk, and eggs. I direct FACT's Humane Farming Program, which provides a variety of opportunities for livestock and poultry farmers. And this webinar is part of our Humane Farming webinar series. Please visit our website to learn more about our other farmer services and our upcoming webinars. So this time, I'm very pleased to introduce a renowned presenter, Sarah Flack. Sarah is the author of several books, including The Art and Science of Grazing and Organic Dairy Production, and is a nationally known speaker and consultant on grazing and organic livestock production. She grew up in Vermont on a Vermont family farm that used management-intensive grazing and mob stocking, and later studied pasture management at the University of Vermont. Sarah's approach as a consultant, writer, and speaker is to take a practical approach to applying the science of grazing. We are very, very lucky to have her with us today and over the next few weeks to share her experience and expertise on grazing management best practices. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Sarah so that she may begin her presentation. Sarah, please take it away.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I hear you fine.
We do have a couple of people who have said they don't have audio. It looks like there's maybe 3 people without audio.
Yes.
Coming in the chat box, so.
I'll give them some instructions about how they might want to call in on the phone.
Great, because it sounds like most people have audio, so it's just a handful.
Yeah.
All right. And then, at the same time, you might have to remind me, how do I take control of the slides here? Do I just click on them and they start moving?
So there's a bottom over your name. If you scroll over it, you'll see some arrows.
Oh yeah, I see it now.
Okay.
The technology. Okay. Great. So, well, it's great we've got such a nice big crowd of folks today, and it looks like we've got people from at least 3 different countries with all different types of livestock. And so in addition to the information that I'm going to cover today, there are also a couple of handouts that I have sent to Larissa, which she'll make available to you all somehow. And one is a written sort of narrative description of some of the information that I'll be going through today. And then another is a worksheet that works. It's one of the ways to work through the process of doing some of the pasture size and acreage calculations that we'll be doing at the very end of today's session. And then I also just wanted to say that I've got lots of other webinars. When this recording is ready, they'll be posted on my website. And there's also other free articles and free materials for you on my website. So this is a 3-part series because there's no way we can fit all the information into just today. So today I'm going to focus on talking about grazing management from the plant's perspective, and very specifically I'm going to be talking about perennial plants and how we can really meet their physiologic needs so that they can grow really well and persist in our pastures over time. So I won't be delving into a lot of things from the livestock perspective until the next webinar, which is on the 18th of February. And at that one, I'll really dig into grazing from the livestock perspective. I come from a background where I primarily work with ruminant farms. And so even though I do work some with poultry and pigs and other animals like that, I'm mostly going to focus on the needs of the sheep and the cows and the goats. So really looking at ruminants on that February 18th Part 2 webinar. And then the third webinar on March 3rd, I'm going to look at putting all of that information together and looking at how do we use the livestock while meeting their needs and take care of the needs of the plants so they're improving over time. So that's just a little bit of overview of what I'm going to cover. And so today will be very plant oriented. And so You can certainly ask your livestock-related questions today, but I may put them off and answer them at the next webinar when we really dig into that. So this is a photo of a well-managed pasture on a grass-fed dairy farm in the Northeast. And so these are cool season perennial grasses. For some of you who are further south, you might have a mix of cool season and warm season grasses. But what we're seeing here is a mixture of grasses and legumes, the nitrogen fixing plants in the pasture, and also some plants that we call forbs, which are also an important part to have in the pasture diversity. So that is actually some forage chicory in the foreground there. There's also some dandelion and plantain. So what do we mean by good grazing management? It goes by a lot of different names, but in general, it is a grazing system that allows the grazing activity of the livestock to improve the quality and the productivity of the pasture over time. And so in order to be able to talk about that, let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of our pasture perennial plants. So these are perennials. So they're not a plant that you're planting in the spring and then using and then replanting the next year. These are plants that are going to persist long term in your pasture for years or decades or even hundreds of years. You can have these perennial pastures getting better over time with good grazing management. So looking at this as a grass plant, we're going to look at the very bottom of this plant to begin with. You can see there's the root system. That's where the plants are drawing their water and a lot of their nutrients out of the soil. Then right at the soil surface, you've got the crown of the plant. And this is the part of the plant I'm going to talk about a lot today. This is where a lot of the energy reserve for this perennial grass plant is stored. So this is the energy for the plant, not necessarily for the animal. So when this plant is allowed to grow up tall and photosynthesize with lots of green leafy material, it's going to be storing that energy for its next growth cycle in the lower part of the stem and in the crown of the plant. Some of it also goes down into the roots and is used for growth in other parts of the plant. But we really want to look at and find out where the crowns in our plants are and then really try to protect them. Not only are they the energy storage area for a lot of the plant's needs, but this is also where you have lots of growing points that will produce new tillers as this plant starts to regrow and mature over several years. So you can see there are a couple of different types of tillers coming out of the crown of this grass plant down near the soil surface. You can see there are a couple of lots of small vegetative tillers that are coming out that at that point just look like individual leaves, but they're actually little folded up bunches of leaves. And then you can see there's one elongated tiller in this drawing. And that's where you can see what that tiller looks like when the stem elongates so that that grass plant can go into the flowering and then the seed production phase. And so you can see the stem has elongated in between the nodes. So the inner nodes have elongated, lifting some of the leaves and the flowers, and in this case, seeds up. This is one of the drawings from my book, and there's a lot more of information on this in my book and in some of my other videos, and also in the handout that you can get from Larissa for those of you who don't want to buy the book. So that's the Cliff Notes version of the information. So as Larissa, there's just a tiny bit of background noise.
On your end, yeah, I can hear that.
Yeah. I don't know where that's coming from. Anyway. I think it just stopped because I think everybody's muted. All right, so now we've looked at the basic plant anatomy. We know that in our grazing practices, we need to not let the animals graze these plants too short so that they're not going to consume the crown and the lower parts of the stem. And we now have an idea of what the tillers look like. And we're going to talk a lot about tillers today and again next week when we talk about meeting the nutritional needs of the animals. So this is the most important slide of the day. This is the grazing guidelines, which summarize what you need to know in order to be able to tell if you've got a grazing system that you're looking at, which is a good one. So good grazing systems always have variable recovery periods based on how fast that the plants are growing. So this means that if your plants are growing really fast, you may be able to bring the animals back to that paddock and graze it sooner because those plants are fully recovered and ready to be grazed again. And then at other times of the year, if the recovery period and regrowth speed is really slow, then you're going to need to slow down that rotation and move the animals through the paddocks more slowly. Then the second grazing guideline is that you want to have relatively short periods of occupation. So you're not leaving the animals in the paddock for so long that they are starting to regraze plants that are in the act of regrowth. You want to put them in there, let them graze the plants down to the correct height, not taking them too short, and then take them out of there. So that makes it sound really simple, but it isn't necessarily simple. There's a lot of different pieces of this that we'll talk about so we can see how to really apply those guidelines in a really flexible and practical way to your individual farm situation. So here we can see a photo of a group of lambs with a guard dog. They're in a paddock. This is a 12-hour period of occupation in this paddock, but they've just been in for about an hour. You can see down in the lower left corner of the slide where they were the previous 12 hours. So they've grazed that down pretty short. In some areas, it might have been grazed down a little shorter than ideal, but it's hard to convince the sheep not to graze it down too short. We'll talk about that at the next webinar in particular. And so you can see that this is a nice sized paddock. They have a couple of shade trees, a shade structure, their water, and their guard dog, and that the blue tub in the middle is their mineral feeder. And so they've just been moved in here. They've started to graze it down, and probably by the next morning, they'll have finished grazing there and be ready to move into a new paddock. Here's another example of a well-managed grazing system. So you can see in the foreground, there's a 2-strand high tensile fence, and then a little bit further into the background, you can see there's the water tub and a single strand of the polywire in this case. And so in this case, it's a single strand of polywire because this is a grazing rotation for dairy heifers and they don't need the electric net fence. And you can see as you look further into the background in this slide, you can see there's a whole series of paddocks. And we'll do a little bit of math at the end of this session to look at how to do the paddock size calculations. So just to circle back to this question of what is a good grazing system, these short periods of occupation and variable recovery periods, what that does over time is it allows the grazing management itself to improve the pastures by increasing plant density, pasture quality. The productivity of the pasture should improve over time. We're also able to improve soil health. And then from the animal's perspective, we can maximize dry matter intake from the pasture to improve the livestock productivity over time also. So here's an acronym I'm going to define. DMI stands for dry matter intake. So in the US and Canada, where I do most of my work, but I often find this in other countries also, the most common type of grazing system is still an extensive grazing system or a continuous grazing system, where the animals are put in the same paddock for weeks or months or maybe the entire grazing season. That is not an ideal grazing system from the plant's perspective because those plants are never really allowed to have a full rest and recovery period, and they're also frequently grazed down too short. And this table is in one of the handouts that Larissa has for you. So a somewhat improved system would be a rotational system where you might have a few paddocks that you're rotating through, but if that's on a set fixed rotation schedule, it's still not getting you the really good grazing management that you need to meet the plant's needs. So you might have enough pasture or good quality pasture in the early part of the grazing season, but over time the pasture quality will decline. So that's why I like to talk about these other types of grazing systems that have variable regrowth or recovery periods. And to give these a more specific name, I typically find that people doing these really good grazing management systems, they are doing what's called holistic planned grazing, which was developed by Alan Savory, or they might be doing management intensive grazing, which is the term developed by Jim Garish. So those are examples of two really good grazing management systems that meet these grazing guidelines. So I just want to quickly say that you're certainly going to be reading and probably already reading about the negative impacts of livestock on our planetary ecosystem. And so when we're talking about grazing management, it is really important to differentiate between good grazing management that is improving soil health and pasture productivity and plant health, and poor grazing systems which really do damage not just the plants, but also the soils. This is an example of some overgrazing damage in Europe, where I was traveling a couple of years ago. Sometimes that grazing damage is not so immediately obvious. This is another example of overgrazing damage. In this case, we don't have bare soil showing and soil erosion happening, but we have plants that grow very slowly and in some cases never get taller than about 1 or 2 inches in height. And so these plants, the way they have adapted to being grazed too frequently and grazed down too short for too many years in a row is they stay really short. So some of you might be saying, oh yeah, I have some areas on my farm, or I've seen these areas where even when I take the animals out for about, a month or two, those plants just don't grow tall enough. And so that's when you're really seeing these effects of overgrazing damage that we'll talk more about. And just to be specific, in this slide, we had actually pulled the animals out of this area and let it regrow for about 45 days to see if we could use extended rest periods to let these damaged plants recover. And the tall plants, the kind of bunches of plants that you're seeing, are the only ones that really grew tall, and that was unfortunately the buttercups, which the animals didn't really want to eat. So what we're going to need to do is talk about then how do we get from a continuous grazing system to an improved grazing system. And so this is just looking at what happens if you take a single paddock. So the top left, this is another one of the drawings from my book. In that top left slide, you can see you've got a single paddock and the animals are spread out over the whole farm. And then as we move to the right, we now move that farm system into just dividing it in half. So you've got 2 paddocks. So one half of the farm is resting, the other half is being grazed by the animals. That's a little bit of an improvement, but you're going to be able to rest one area, but the area that they're grazing is probably going to be grazed for too long. So now we move to the third slide where you can see now we've got 4 paddocks. So we've got 3 resting paddocks and 1 that they're grazing. So again, this is getting better. It'll be easier to manage. But in my experience, it's not until we move to having 6 to 8 paddocks, there's 8 paddocks in this last slide, where we can really start to have enough paddocks to have a better level of control over that period of occupation and the length of the regrowth or recovery periods. And then if you're an operation that has dairy animals where you're moving them to a fresh paddock after each milking, you're probably going to be using a lot of portable fence, and you may go as far as giving them a fresh paddock twice a day, or as you move to higher stocking density grazing systems to improve the pastures more rapidly, you might be moving them to fresh paddocks multiple times a day. So you may end up with, in effect, having 45 or 90 paddocks in some of those systems. But I want to make it clear that just putting in as few as 6 to 8 paddocks is a really excellent first step in improving the control that you have over your grazing system to make pasture improvements. So this is what it's going to look like. This is a dairy herd in northern Vermont, right near the Canadian border. And this is a really nice example of a high quality pasture that is fully recovered. You can see there's a nice mixture of grasses and legumes. One of you is asking the question of, I want to measure the height of my grasses. We're going to talk about that a little bit as one of the ways to figure out if your pasture grasses are fully recovered. And you can see these grasses, the tillers have elongated. The grasses, each tiller has somewhere between 2 and 5 leaves on each tiller, and the upper leaves are starting to flop over. The other way you can tell this is fully recovered is the red clover is blooming, and it's right up to the briskets on these dairy cows. So that's an example of a fully recovered pasture. Here's another example of a fully recovered pasture. This is another dairy farm. This is a dairy in central Vermont where they were, this is 100% grass-fed, so they're not feeding any grain. You can see these cows have really nice condition. They're doing very well in this system with the well-managed pasture as their primary feed source. But you can see this is a little bit earlier in the year, and these are cool season grasses in this photo. And so you can see that these grasses, some of them have headed out and have seed heads on them, but there's still lots of vegetative material. But again, these are, from the plant's perspective, these grasses are fully recovered and ready to be grazed. They've had enough time to photosynthesize and store lots of energy in the lower parts of the grass stems and crowns. And I like to give credit to the people who many hundreds of years ago figured a lot of this stuff out already. So I'm not inventing anything new. This is James Anderson writing in the late 1700s about this sort of multi-paddock grazing system. And he wrote that a farmer who has a large pasture should have it divided into 15 or 20 divisions nearly of equal value. It would please the animal palate to induce them to eat it greedily and fill their bellies before they thought of roaming about and thus destroying it with their feet. I am satisfied that in some cases the actual produce of the same field by a judicious management in this respect compared to bad management may be augmented fourfold in the same season. So what he's saying is that if we subdivide our farm into 15 or 20 paddocks and start a grazing rotation, so we're resting some of those plants and grazing the plants down in each paddock relatively quickly, that you're going to increase the productivity of your pastures 4 times as much as it was before. And that's been exactly my experience. So there's lots of us teaching this stuff, but a lot of the fundamentals have been known for hundreds of years. So just to make things complicated, our pasture plants do not grow the same way or at the same speed throughout the whole grazing season, the growing season. And also there are going to be some regional differences here. So this is an example of the growth curves where we're looking at the cool season forages. So far, I've mostly been showing you photos of the cool season grasses and legumes. They are going to grow very rapidly in the spring as the soils first thaw and warm up. And then they're going to slow down their growth rates midsummer. And the further south you go and the hotter and the drier your summer is, the more those plants are going to move towards either very slow growth or they may go into complete dormancy during the hot, dry midsummer. And then in most regions, you're going to have another burst of productivity in the late summer or fall or early winter, where those cool season forages will become productive again. And then in the middle, we've got the warm season forage graph, and these are going to be your warm season grasses up here in the north. Those are often going to be annuals that I'm not really going to talk about today, but those would be things like sorghum sudan grass or millet. And then as we go further south, you've got the warm season perennial grasses, like some of the gamma grasses and switch grasses and even Johnson grass. So those are the plants that grow really well in that hotter and also the drier midsummer. So on some farms, you may be grazing a lot of warm season forages, either the annuals or the perennials. Other farms, you're going to be entirely grazing cool season forages, and then some farms, it'll be a mix of each. All right, hopefully my slides are cycling through at the same speed that you guys get to see them. So I'm going to go through a bunch of the photos of some cool season grass pastures so that you can see what the stages of growth look like first thing in the spring, so you can start to think about when they are ready to start grazing. So this is just me using a pen to measure the pre-grazing height. You can see this is mostly Kentucky bluegrass, one of the many cool season grasses with white clover in here. So these plants are obviously not yet ready to graze. The tillers have not started to elongate. We've got a couple of grass leaves that are less than 2 inches in height. So this next slide, we're looking at possibly just a couple of days later. You can see some of the grass leaves have started to elongate. There's a little bit of timothy and some orchard grass in here. These are the cool season grasses some of you are asking about in the chat bar questions right now. So they're getting taller, but they're still not ready to graze. So the sheep is grazing them anyway. And the reason the sheep is grazing them anyway is if you wait in the spring for your entire farm to be ready to start grazing, it's going to get by you. These, especially if you've got these cool season grasses, which many of you do based on where you're located in the information you're putting in the chat box. You've really got to start grazing some area of your farm before it's in the fully recovered stage each spring to make sure that the whole farm doesn't end up producing seed heads before you get through that first grazing rotation. So here I am using a grazing stick about a week later to try to measure the pre-grazing height and also the density of the plants in the pasture. So this pasture is now, most of the plants in here are pretty much ready to graze. You can see you're starting to get some elongated grass tillers in here, and the dandelions are in bloom, and some of them have gone into the seed stage. And here we have an example of a fully recovered pasture. This one's definitely ready to graze. You can see some of the grasses have moved all the way into the reproductive stage with flowers or even seeds on them. Here are two more examples of fully recovered pastures. The one on the left has a lot of Kentucky bluegrass in it. Those are the seed heads that you can see. And that one's obviously fully recovered because it's got the seed heads in there. From an animal's perspective, we'll talk about this next webinar. These are relatively low digestibility now, and it might be hard to meet the animal's nutritional needs with this grass. But from a plant perspective, those seeded out plants on your left are definitely fully recovered. The plants on the right are also fully recovered. They are just in a vegetative stage. So let's talk a little bit more. Oh yeah, I'll show you some slides of individual tillers so we can look at some other ways to see if things are fully recovered in a minute. This is another fully recovered pasture. You can see there's a mixture, really lovely, diverse mixture of plants in here, not just the legumes and the grasses, but we've got other forb species. Some of them might have some medicinal as well as nutritional qualities in the dandelion, and I think they had a little bit of salad burnet and some other species mixed in there, some chicory. So this is just looking at in the northern temperate zone. This is an example of how many days it may take on your farm for those plants to reach that fully recovered pre-grazing stage. So you can see in that graph showing in the spring, on this farm, it's about 22 days for that diverse mixture of grasses, legumes, and forbs to meet that pre-grazing height that's ideal for grazing from the plant's perspective. So you got 22 days to rotate around those paddocks in the spring, but as it gets hotter and drier, it's going to be about 40 days on this pasture. So each of you will have to figure out what this is on your own farm. There may be some local regional resources that you'll be able to use, or you can also just keep records from year to year to figure out what is the ideal recovery period at different times of year on your own farm. This is just a reminder, bringing us back to that first slide that we looked at, looking at this grass anatomy, is in addition to letting these grasses have enough time to grow tall enough and photosynthesize enough to be able to store energy for their next regrowth period, after they're grazed off, these grazing periods need to be short enough and managed well enough so that you're not letting your livestock eat those lower parts of the plant where the crown is with all of those growing points and all of those plant energy reserves. And so for those of you with horses, I'm going to pick on horses. They have teeth on the top and the bottom in the front of their mouth. And so they are able to graze your pastures down much shorter than you want them to. So they can really damage the plants and be more challenging to manage in some ways that are ruminants. The ruminants just have the teeth on one side and then they've got gums on the other. So it's a little harder for them to graze the plants quite so aggressively short. Though, as you can see from some of the slides I'll show you in all of these webinars of sheep, they can certainly graze things down too short. So let's talk a little bit about how much to leave behind in the pasture. This is called the post-grazing residual. So this is the material, the plant material that is left behind that is still attached to the plant. So these are leaves that have maybe been bitten off or trampled a little bit, but they're still attached to the plant and they're going to be able to start photosynthesizing right away and let the plants start generating energy so they can begin the regrowth process. So this is a nice example of a post-grazing residual in a cool season perennial grass legume pasture. If this was a warm season perennial pasture, it sounds like a few of you are grazing warm season grasses. The warm season grasses tend to like a much taller post-grazing residual, and it varies quite a bit from species to species. Chapter 6 in my book does go into some of the specifics of the different cool season and warm season grasses and legumes and how to manage them separately, just in case I don't get time to get into some of those questions that are coming in the next couple of sessions. But the third webinar will get into some of that in detail. Here's another example of a nice post-grazing residual, and look at the unevenness of this. A good post-grazing residual is not going to look perfectly pruned or clipped or mowed. There's going to be areas where they're going to graze it down shorter and areas where they're going to leave it taller. Here's another example of post-grazing residual in process. This is a beef herd. I believe this slide is from a farm in Maryland. And so there's actually a mixture of some warm season and some cool season grasses in this pasture. The beef herd has come in and they're going to graze in about a 12-hour period of occupation. They're going to take down a lot of the plants as short or maybe a little bit shorter than what you can see in the foreground, and they're actually going to end up leaving some of the big bunches of the orchard grass, which is one of our cool season grasses, and in this case they have some Johnson grass in this pasture, so they're going to leave some of those taller bunches behind, and that post-grazing residual is going to be fine for these cows. Here's another example of a good post-grazing residual. In the foreground, you can see where the cows were the previous day. This is a 24-hour period of occupation. So they've grazed it down to, 2 to 6 inches of post-grazing residual. And then they've been moved into a new paddock for the next 24-hour recovery period. So as I can see there's lots of questions coming in about clipping or mowing your pastures after you graze them. And if I don't have time to get to that today, I have a ton of photos on when post-grazing mowing is a good idea and when it's not a good idea that I'll cover in the next webinar when we look at pasture quality from the livestock perspective. Great questions coming in on that. So I want to look now at the regrowth that occurs after that initial grazing because it looks kind of different. So that initial regrowth that we're monitoring in the spring, those leaves are small and pointy at the tips. But in this case, the grasses have been grazed off, and now these grazed off leaves that have kind of flat, bitten off tips are starting to elongate. So this is a photo of a pasture that was grazed down quite short, and this is just 2 or 3 days after it's been grazed, and you can see the white clover leaves are already elongating and starting to pop up and grow, and a lot of the grass leaves on the grasses that have been grazed off are re-elongating their leaves. So this is a critical time from the plant's perspective to make sure that the animals are no longer having any access to these plants. These plants at this stage are having to mobilize a lot of their stored energy reserves to be able to fuel the regrowth of these leaves so that they can get to a point where they're able to start photosynthesizing and generating their enough photosynthate, enough energy to really get into that fast recovery stage. So this is something to train yourself to see in your pastures. And in the way to avoid having the animals in these areas too much is if you're strip grazing, you want to move the back fence up faster. Somebody's just asked that question. That's great. So yes, move the back fence up faster if you're strip grazing, or make your paddocks smaller and move them more frequently if you're using a separate paddock system in this grazing system. So this next slide is about a week later. And so now you can see we have a mixture of some of these leaves that were bitten off and just re-elongated after that last grazing. And then we've got some new leaves that have the pointy tips that are starting to grow. So this is the point at which both you and your livestock might be really tempted to just put the animals in there and let them graze it off. It's certainly very nutritious from an animal perspective, but from the plant perspective, these plants are still not fully recovered and they need more time to regrow, photosynthesize, and store more energy. So here we are another week later, and you can see these plants are now really tall. This is my hand, which is 5.5 inches from the bottom of my palm up to the top of my thumb. I frequently use my own hand as measuring pastures. And so some of these plants are, 7 to 10 inches tall, or the individual leaves. So if we're just looking at height, we might think this pasture is ready to graze again, but it's actually not. So this one obviously is ready to graze. These have actually elongated. They're plenty tall and they've gone into a seeding stage. So height by itself really isn't going to tell us everything we need to know about whether these plants are ready to grow. So here's an example of a pasture where a lot of these plants are more than 9 inches tall. But what I'm going to do in this pasture is I'm going to pick an individual grass tiller. So this is a stem with the leaves on it. I'm going to pick it right down at the soil surface, and I'm going to count how many leaves are on here. And so this grass tiller, which happens to be tall fescue, has 3 fully developed new leaves. It's a little confusing because there's a shadow behind it on my notebook there, but there's 3 fully developed new leaves, and then there's 1 leaf in the middle. So I would call this a 3.5, almost a 4-leaf stage for the tiller. So this grass plant is ready to be grazed. And in general, for most of the grass species, when they get to the 3.5 leaf stage or higher, they're ready to be grazed. There is some variation from species to species. Here you can see the 2 tillers on the left are both in that 1.5 leaf stage. They are definitely not ready to be grazed, but that one in the middle, even though it's only got 1.5 leaves on it, is really tall and might fool you if you weren't picking some tillers and really counting the leaves. The one all the way over on the right has enough leaves that in this case I would have called it ready to graze. So I'm just going through some of these methods really quick to give you an idea of all of the different ways that you can start training your observation skills to be able to figure out if your pasture is really ready to graze. And this is how this grazing guideline number 1, these variable recovery periods are based on your observation of how fast the plants are growing on your own farm. And so it's something each individual farmer has to figure out on their own farm. So a little bit on overgrazing damage. I think it's important to just define this. Overgrazing damage is any time that grazing is happening when the plant is still growing from its carbohydrate or energy reserves. It's not yet fully recharged its energy reserves, and it's not able to grow just from the energy it's producing from its current active photosynthesis. So that's really when this overgrazing damage happens. The plant is in that in-between stage of regrowth. It's just not ready yet. And the situations where this most commonly happens is when we leave an animal in the paddock for too long. So if that slide I showed you a couple slides ago of those plants that were regrowing, re-elongating their leaves really rapidly, if you left the animals in that paddock for even just 3 days in a row, by day 3, they would be doing some overgrazing damage because they would be grazing off plants that were just starting to regrow but weren't ready yet to be grazed. The other way that we can do this overgrazing damage is by putting the animals back into the paddock before the plants in there are fully recovered. And that's what results in the photo on the right-hand side of this slide, which are these plants that are permanently stunted and just can't grow very tall. These plants have just basically figured out over time that the best survival technique is don't ever grow tall enough that you can be bitten off. And so the plants that have survived over the many years of continuous short grazing in this paddock are the ones that stay really, really short, or the ones that are mildly toxic. So each of those little mounds of what looks like lush, good forage in there is actually a buttercup plant that is able to not be grazed really short because it's irritating to the mouths of the livestock. So there are a lot of different ways to monitor our pastures and train ourselves on what is happening over time, train those observation skills. And so in the US, the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, has a really great series of workshop sheets on pasture monitoring. If you study holistic planned grazing through the Savory Institute or Holistic Management International, they will also provide you with training and worksheets on how to do pasture monitoring. This is a one-page version that's in the appendix of my book that I was just trying to come up with a system for farmers who are never going to do more than one side of one piece of paper. So this is a very short version of that pasture monitoring or observation that you can do so that you can start to track your pastures over time and see if they're getting worse or getting better over time under your management, and then adjust the management as you need to. And we'll talk more about that in the third webinar. So I want to very quickly go through some of the math of grazing planning. And Larissa has a worksheet that is available to any of you. I think she'll either post it on the website or email it to you. I'm not sure which. And that will walk you through one of the methods to calculate paddock sizes and acreage needs. And I will say what I'm about to go through is just one of the methods for doing this sort of a math. There's a lot of different ways to do it. So what we need to know is what size should the paddocks be, and how many acres do you need overall. So we're going to start out by figuring out how big the paddock should be for one grazing period, in this case for 1 day. So here's the formula. We need to know the dry matter required for that herd or flock of sheep or cows or goats for 1 day. So DM stands for dry matter. What's their dry matter or nutritional requirement from the pasture? And we're going to divide that by the amount of dry matter that's available for them to graze off or harvest themselves per acre. And that's going to give us the acreage needed per day. So what we need to know is what's that herd or flock's dry matter intake requirement from the pasture, and how much dry matter is available in the pasture. And so as I go through these slides, if you feel like, wow, this is just way too fast, there is a video of me on my website where I go through some of the methods to do direct measurement of the amount of dry matter in the pasture, and then I go through some of the paddock size calculation math in that video. Once we know how many acres we need per day for the whole herd or flock, then we can multiply that times the number of days of regrowth or recovery that you need, and that will give you an idea of how many total acres that you'll need to be able to do a good grazing rotation, depending on the time of the year and how fast that regrowth period is. And this will help you determine whether you have the right number of animals for your farm, or if you're really overstocked or you're really understocked. So that calculation there is called a stocking rate calculation. It's about the total number of animals on your whole farm. The stocking density calculation is talking about the number of animals or the pounds of animals in an individual paddock for that one day or whatever the period of occupation is. When I teach this as a full day long grazing school, we'll take a whole hour just to do the paddock math and the acreage math. So I am going through this kind of fast. But hopefully the additional video and the handouts can help with this. So here I am measuring the amount of dry matter available per acre using a grazing stick, which is one of the low-cost ways to do this sort of direct measurement of the pasture. This is using a rising plate meter to see how much dry matter there is per acre. In this case, you're using a rising plate with the computer that's giving you the numbers. And then this is a spreadsheet which Jim Garish has in his book. He's got a great grazing book called Management Intensive Grazing. And this is a chart from his book where he helps you figure out how many pounds of dry matter is going to be available per inch of forage in each pasture that your animals are calculating. So that's 3 different ways to start to figure out how much dry matter is available for the animals to harvest per acre. So you can do these pasture calculations. It's really important that we do this math using the pounds of dry matter that they're able to harvest from the pasture, not the total amount. So, for example, in a well-managed pasture, you might have 2,800 pounds of dry matter total in the pasture, but you're only going to harvest a third to a half of that and leave the other half behind. So typically you're going to be harvesting maybe 1,100 to 1,400 pounds of dry matter per acre, even though there's a total of 2,800 pounds available per acre in there. So I'm going to do one example calculation with you here. And this is a group of dairy heifers. So we've got 18 bred heifers. So these are good-sized heifers. And the dry matter demand, DMD, stands for dry matter demand. That is where we've looked at a feeding chart for heifers of this size that are pregnant. And we see that they need about 20 pounds of dry matter from the pasture per day per animal in this group. And we've either used Jim Garish's grazing dry matter per acre chart, or we've done a direct measurement or some other estimate, but we've figured out that they are going to be able to harvest 1,100 pounds of dry matter per acre. So now we can see that we know how much we have available for them to graze and harvest per acre, and we know how much each individual animal needs to eat. So just walking through the math a little bit more, we've got 20 pounds of dry matter needed per animal, and there's 18 animals. So the total dry matter need of that whole group is 360 pounds per day. So that'll meet their nutritional need from the pasture. And so we're going to divide that by how much is available, that 1,100 pounds. And so they need 0.33 acres. So they need a third of an acre per day to meet the pasture dry matter intake need of that group of animals. So now we know what it is per day. Now let's see how do we convert that into the total number of acres needed so that we can really do our grazing planning. So looking at 2 different times of the growing season on this farm, we've got a 20-day rotation and we've got a 30-day rotation. So this is the number of days that those pastures need to regrow before we can graze them again. So we take that 0.33 acres that we need for 24 hours, we multiply it times 20 days, but we have to add 1 paddock. So that because the paddock that they're in isn't recovering yet, it's still being actively grazed. And so we need 6.9 acres to rotate that group through when we're in that fast 20-day regrowth period in the spring. But then once regrowth slows down and we get to the 30-day recovery period, we need to increase it to 10.2 acres. And actually, on the farm where I was working with them on this planning process, later in the year, this farm typically hits a 45-day recovery period. And so they either needed to add in significant amounts of acreage to their grazing rotation to make sure those plants were getting fully rested, or they were increasing the amount of supplemental feed for these heifers and slowing down the rotation that way. So obviously the additional nutritional needs, the additional dry matter needs to go to those heifers somehow. And so in some cases you might increase the supplemental feed, and in some cases you might just add more acreage into that rotation. So now we've got the math where we have an idea of how many acres we need for that grazing group each month of the year as those regrowth periods get slower and we need more acreage. So now we can sit down with a farm map and look at where it makes sense to start grazing first thing in the spring, where you might want to take a first or even a second cut of hay and then add some of that land into the grazing rotation using some temporary fence to allow those recovery periods to be longer later in the year. And then this is just looking at one of the many types of grazing planning or charting systems that you can use to write down your grazing plan. In this case, this is the holistic grazing plan that a farmer is using. This is from Alan Savory's grazing method. And you can see the farmer has gone through in one color or in pencil. The first time they'll go through and write in where they plan out to graze throughout the year, and then they've gone back in afterwards and written in or drawn in where they actually grazed. So one of the most important rules that I learned when I was learning grazing planning was we come up with a plan, and then you always need to assume that your plan is going to be wrong, because you'll end up having either overestimated or underestimated the dry matter intake need of your group of animals. It may rain more or less than usual, so your pastures might grow better or grow slower. And so you need to be adjusting things constantly. The grazing planning systems that I really like the most are where you write down where you plan to graze each month of your grazing season, and then you write down a record of where you actually do graze. Some farmers find that visually they don't do well with these sorts of spreadsheet systems. These spreadsheets are available either online, or you can use the paper version the way this farmer is. Some farmers prefer to use a map or a notebook, and I work with farmers who have all different types of learning styles, so it's really important to just find the one that works best for you. And this farmer was using a combination of the maps and the grazing charts. So that was a very high-speed overview of a whole lot of information. So I just want to remind people that this is webinar number 1 in a series of 3 webinars, and the purpose of this webinar was to really focus on things from the plant's perspective. The next webinar is going to focus on grazing management from the livestock perspective, and then the third webinar in early March will circle back and pull a lot of this information together. We'll talk a little bit more about specific different types of the plant species that we've been mentioning, and how to combine the information we need to know about how to meet the livestock's nutritional and well-being needs with the needs of the plants.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. That was fantastic. We're getting all kinds of clapping hands and thumbs up floating across the screen. So we do have a couple of minutes, maybe 5-10 minutes to take some questions. I know that there have been quite a few that have come in. Sarah, I don't know where exactly you would like to start. I know some of them might be best answered next week. So
yeah, I'm just scrolling back through some of these questions. I will target answering some of the plant ones first.
yes.
So yes, there's been some great questions coming in about how much of the dry matter you're harvesting per acre. And so yes, you are not harvesting all of the dry matter that's out there. You're harvesting about 1/3 to 1/2 of the material from those plants, and then you're leaving a third to a half of that material, sometimes even more than half of the material behind in that post-grazing residual. And one of the things that you will notice is if you shift your grazing system so that you're harvesting a little less with the animals and you're leaving behind more of a post-grazing residual, you're leaving behind more leafy green material that can immediately start photosynthesizing and fueling plant regrowth. You're also leaving behind more of the energy storage areas of those plants. So your recovery periods will potentially become shorter on your farm. So if your animals and your grazing system is adapted to grazing things down really, really short every time the animals graze a pasture, and you're used to having, to wait a month or more to regraze those pastures, as you train your animals, which is not easy, but as you retrain your animals to not graze those plants down super short, you'll start to see those plants become much more vigorous, growing back more rapidly. But it is a significant paradigm shift to start leaving more behind in your grazing rotation, having that taller post-grazing residual, pastures potentially looking kind of messy and rough. And we'll look at a bunch of slides in the next webinar on when it's useful to do that post-grazing clipping to tidy things up and when that's really not necessary or even damaging. I'm just scrolling back through some of these questions.
Yeah,
Larissa, if you've got stuff that you want to call
sure.
out too, you're welcome to do that.
Can you
There's a great question on reseeding
Yes.
and, when should we till up and reseed the pasture? We'll talk about that in the third webinar. But there's another wonderful quote, in this case from the 1950s, from Andre Voisin, who wrote a lot about grazing management back then. And he said that over time, a well-managed perennial pasture will just get better and better under good grazing management, potentially improving without the addition of any seed or reseeding for as much as 100 years. And so the big picture answer to that question is, once you have planted the ideal grass, legume, forb plants for your farm in that pasture, if you're doing really good grazing management, ideally you should never have to plow up and reseed that pasture again. Now, there are situations where that may be something that you want to consider doing. For example, if for some reason you started to get a very invasive weed, or you had some severe problems with soil compaction or something where getting in there and doing that tillage and reseeding really became necessary, then we might talk about that. But my approach is always to see, number one, how can we use the livestock themselves to improve the pastures over time so that we can avoid that disruption to your grazing system of having to wait for a new seeded pasture to grow back, and also the really high cost of doing that sort of reseeding. So it is something that certainly we do. We will renovate and reseed in some cases, but we try everything that's less expensive first. So there's a lot of questions coming in about what plants, what types of plants should I be seeing in my pasture? What should I be planting? And that is very regionally specific. And I am seeing a lot of people who are being sold pasture mixes that look really good on paper, but are not really well adapted to your specific geographic area, your climate, and also your microclimate. It may vary from one valley to the next. You might also have some soils that are really wet and some soils that are really dry. They're each going to be better suited to a different sort of pasture mix. So I'm not going to be able to make specific recommendations on what you should plant, because you guys are from such an interesting, diverse geographic region of at least 3 countries and a lot of the states in the US and overseas, all different climates and soil types.
Sarah, you might have already addressed this in some ways, but someone's asking what to do or what you could do to undo the stunted growth, maybe due to overgrazing or other conditions.
I have not answered that question, and I'm really glad that somebody asked it. Thank you for that. Yeah, so what do you do if you buy a farm or inherit the farm, and the grazing management on those pastures has been very short, continuous grazing for a lot of years. And you're ending up with this, it would be really nice for a golf putting green, very short plants that just won't grow tall. Another symptom of overgrazing damage is low plant density, which makes lots of space for weeds to move in that might be perennials, or they might be biennial weeds, or they might be annual weeds coming in. And so, what do we do in that case where the damage has already been done? How are we going to fix it? So I go through kind of a series of steps in these situations. The first thing I do is I pull a soil test. I didn't have time to really talk about soils today, but obviously so much of this grazing system depends on the health and fertility of the soil under those plants. So I'm going to pull a soil test. I'm going to also do some measurements of soil compaction, and also make sure that we don't have super wet, saturated soils where we've got standing water at certain times of the year. And so then once I've made sure that the soil is good, the soil fertility is good, we don't have a lack of drainage issue or very, very low organic matter, then the next thing I'm going to do is look at whether just doing a long rest period, essentially fallowing that pasture for a month or two, is that going to allow the plants in there that are desirable, productive, palatable plants to be able to just start growing and maybe in some cases reseed themselves. So if you've got the right mixture of the plants that you want in there, and not too many weeds, and they have the capacity to actually grow tall enough, if you give them a recovery period, that system will work. In some cases, we're going to go in and do some sort of an intermediate lower cost seeding strategy. So if you've got enough bare soil in there that you think, oh boy, we really should bring in some new seeds, then we're going to go in maybe with a no-till drill and put those seeds right into the soil at the right time of the year when the soil moisture is good, and introduce improved species to that area. Again, making sure we've tested the soil and fixed any soil fertility imbalances or drainage issues or other soil health issues first. So that's one way to introduce the new improved varieties to some of those areas. Other options are you can do what's called a trample seeding. And again, this only works in certain situations, but that's where you would go and spread the seed, spin it onto the soil surface somehow prior to grazing, and then you would do a somewhat high stock density grazing, where then you would be using the sheep or the cattle themselves to kind of use their hoof trampling effect to push those seeds into the soil and get a good soil to seed contact so that they can start to germinate and grow. So that's sometimes in certain situations that can work really well as a low cost way to introduce improved, more productive species into damaged pastures. And then there's also a frost seeding, and frost seedings work quite well with our legume species. They don't necessarily work as well with our grass species typically. But a frost seeding is where you're using the freezing and thawing action of the spring, either in the early spring or sometimes in the late fall. That soil freezing and thawing, contracting and expanding will allow those legume seeds to kind of work down into the soil, because our goal is good seed to soil contact. And then once they're in the soil and the soil warms up, they will germinate and do well. The legumes are really different than the grasses in any of these seeding situations, because our grazing legumes primarily have these very hard seed coats, and they're round seeds and they're kind of relatively heavy. So when you throw them out on the pasture, they quickly go down through the grasses and the thatch and the post-grazing residual, and they're more likely to hit the soil and germinate and do well. Whereas our grass seeds tend to be very light and floaty, so when you throw them out in the pasture, they may come to rest on the thatch itself or on a plant stem. And so they aren't necessarily so easily getting down to the soil and making that good seed to soil contact so that they can germinate and survive well. They're also more susceptible to germinating at the wrong time of the year, and then either drying out in a drought or being frozen in in a late spring frost or a early fall frost or something like that. So,
Thank you. We
how are
probably have
so we're
we probably have quite time for maybe one more question at this point. I
oh,
know we're
you
not
think
gonna
so?
keep
Okay.
everyone. Yeah,
Um,
if that's okay with you.
Um, yeah, so there've been a bunch of questions coming in about supplemental feed for the livestock, and I do think that's an important one for me to circle back on, which is the paddock size calculation that I was doing there was based only on the amount of dry matter that the animals were getting to meet their nutritional needs coming from the pasture. And so you'll see in the worksheet that I sent to Larissa for folks to use, that worksheet factors in the total amount of nutrition, the total amount of dry matter that that animal or that group of animals needs. And then it also puts in the information on what, if anything, are you supplementing them with. So if it's a dairy herd, for example, those goats or sheep or cows are going to be probably coming back to the barn or the milking parlor twice a day or at least once a day. They're probably going to be getting a little bite of grain or some hay if they're all grass fed. And so that's meeting part of their nutrient needs. But in many cases, we are working with flocks or herds where once the grazing season starts, they are out on the pasture and they stay out there through the whole grazing season, and 100% of their nutrient needs are coming from the pasture, obviously with supplemental minerals and water and things like that. And so that will really change how we do the math on these paddock size calculations. So that's been a good question. There's also been some great resources coming in the chat boxes, one of which is somebody has said that NRCS has just released a new set of guidelines for pasture condition scoring. The pasture condition scoring NRCS guidelines, that's one of the pasture ecosystem monitoring systems that are out there to be able to start training yourself with your observation skills to be able to see if your pastures are getting worse over time or getting better over time.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sarah. I do have just a few housekeeping items to share before we sign off. A reminder that immediately following this webinar, you'll be taken to a really brief survey, and we would greatly appreciate it if you take a minute to tell us about your experience, give us some ideas for the future. Also, a recording of this webinar will be available soon. It's going to be archived on our website, and I will email it to all of you later today, along with the handouts that Sarah has mentioned during the webinar. So a quick plug for all of our upcoming webinars. They've been mentioned before, but 2 weeks from now, Sarah will be back with us for part 2 in this series, and this is going to focus again on the livestock. She will discuss the nutritional and behavioral needs of cows, sheep, and goats on pasture, and how you can use this knowledge to design grazing systems, which will make it easier to maximize pasture intake by your herd or your flock. Please note that each session in this series with Sarah does require a separate registration, so I'll be sure to include links to the upcoming webinars in my follow-up email. I'm afraid that is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing your experience and your insight and taking the time to answer all of our great questions. I'm really looking forward to our next session later on this month. And I'd like to thank everyone else out there in the audience for your interest and attention and sticking out, being with us over lunchtime, perhaps in your neck of the woods. It's really great to have all of you here, and thanks for all your support and your clapping hands and thumbs up. I hope that you have a wonderful afternoon, and goodbye for now.